Chris does a great job anytime he presents for us, and I know all of you will enjoy listening to him. Chris obtained a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from Wayland Baptist University, a Master of Science in Biology from Texas Tech in 1996, and a Master of Education from the University of Washington in 2008. He was a research technician for 12 years, specializing in plant tissue culture and genetic transformation technology. But Chris is a creationist from the get-go. He's got a talk. He always does a great job in making his presentations. He's got a dynamic website, awesome site to go into. Works hard on keeping that going. Today he's going to tell us just what he thinks about human evolution. Chris, would you come up and share your talk?
Thank you, Howard. Get myself situated here. I kind of left a mess up here, I think. I don't want to trip on stuff while I'm walking around. Oh, I always enjoy coming up here. I always enjoy. Yeah, this is a great group you guys got here. I hope you realize that. There are very few like this one. Tell you what. Yeah, as Howard indicated, and as is suggested by the title, we're going to be looking at paleoanthropology today, the study of ancient man. And this is somewhat of a hot-button issue, and because of that, any minor little discovery of any sort whatsoever tends to make its way into the popular media, tends to be published in your magazines and promoted on your news broadcasts and these things. Any little minor fragment of bone that a researcher claims to be new, to explain something new about the theories of human evolution, makes its way into the popular media. The problem with that is the vast majority of the population interprets such publications, such publicity, as being very substantive, to be of substantial nature. And popular media articles or news also end up making it into the classroom. Without a doubt. They make their way into the classroom. Regardless of whether or not the discovery, the report itself becomes accepted broadly by the scientific community. If it's announced as being some kind of substantial discovery by the lead investigator, it makes its way into the popular media and makes its way into the classroom, and the public at large believes that what they see was substantial as far as being evidence of human evolution. And I believe that the vast majority of the Christians today that believe evolution ultimately believe it because more of the propaganda of this nature, because of the way that these kind of discoveries are publicized. But one of the things we got to really remember is that with regard to any scientific discipline, whether it's geology or astronomy or in this case paleoanthropology, there are two worldviews, major worldviews, and it's a lot of Christians have accepted evolution, and I believe that they ultimately did so, like I say, because of the media publicity and propaganda. But I believe the human evolution component of that was a major part of it. That once they saw evidence that convinced them that humans had evolved from apes, that was it. Evolution must be true. If humans have evolved from apes, then it must be true. So, with regard to these ape men, there are two worldviews, and we got to look at it from the creationist perspective, and that's going to be my goal. But keep in mind that we have to understand something very important. I say this a lot, but remember, most of the theories that we're being taught by the scientific community today are based on materialism or naturalism. That there is only the material world. That everything that exists today has come about through purely natural processes. They are naturalists. But I've said this many times, it's impossible for a naturalist to correctly understand a world that has a supernatural history. Okay? It's impossible. The fossil record itself cannot be correctly interpreted by a naturalist. It is impossible for them to interpret the fossil record because there was a substantial act of supernatural intervention involved. Okay? It is impossible for naturalists to correctly understand the world that we live in. Scientists are not stupid. They are incredibly intelligent. They are simply trying to interpret the world through a different philosophical axiom. Okay? And you got to be really, really skeptical of accepting theories that were formed by philosophical naturalism and then trying to interpret the Bible, reinterpret the Bible, with the assumption that these things are true. I've had discussions with many your theistic evolutionists that talk about scientific findings as if they're synonymous with facts. And they are simply not. They are interpretations of physical matter. Nothing more. These scientific findings, these claims by scientists, are simply interpretations, but they're being interpreted from a different philosophical worldview. So we got to be really careful about it, just accepting what we're being taught by scientists, incredibly intelligent as they may be, as being facts, because they're simply interpretations. So today in public schools, human evolution is taught as absolute fact. This quote comes from Prentice Hall Biology, 2008 edition, which is without a doubt the most widely used biology textbook in public schools today. And they state it, evolution, as being matter of fact. Not as a theory, not as something that's subject to debate. Matter of fact terminology is always used in the case of evolution. Humans and other primates evolved from a common ancestor that lived more than 65 million years ago. Between 6 and 7 million years ago, the hominoid line gave rise to a branch that ultimately led to the ancestors and closest relatives of modern humans. And they provide diagrams, phylogenetic diagrams, that show that their proposed evolutionary trend. Humans are, of course, today taxonomically classified as primates. And you'll see the humans up here after a long line of evolutionary descent. They believe that the apes, and they lump humans in there with them, all evolved from some ape-like ancestor, several million years ago. The question we want to ask ourselves is, can we reconcile what scientists are teaching today with the Bible? Because a lot of Christians try to do that. Your theistic evolutionists range in views broadly. Some believe that maybe God created the Big Bang and the scientific laws, the physical laws, and let those take over, and those just eventually led to the formations of planets and eventually to the origin of life. God knowing in the beginning that life would ultimately derive from the initial Big Bang and that humans would come about eventually. Some believe that God was involved in creation at many points, or within this timeline at many points. Maybe initiated the Big Bang, and then maybe came back later, a billion years later, and formed the Earth, and then maybe came back a billion years later and formed life on Earth, and then came back later. And maybe at some point when apes eventually reached some stage of cognitive development, then came in and made some last little creation event there and gave them a soul or improved their cognitive capabilities. A lot of views on how much God was involved in an attempt to accept evolution and the Bible. Creationism is one of these, that God was basically involved at multiple times during the timeline. So we got to be careful about this. The Bible, specifically says that God created Adam and Eve, and Adam from the dust of the ground. That did not evolve from some ape. He specifically says Adam was created from the dust of the ground. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. In Mark 6, it says that at the beginning of creation, God made them both male and female. At the beginning of creation, not several billion years later. It wasn't long ago I saw there's a debate between John Mackay, a young earth creationist from Australia, and John Polkinghorne, who is, I believe, still currently the dean of chapel at Cambridge University. This debate between John Polkinghorne and John Mackay took place at Cambridge University. John Polkinghorne, a physicist, was was a professor of physics at Cambridge for like 20 years, and then went off to seminary, got a seminary degree, and came back and later became the dean of chapels at Cambridge. So brilliant, brilliant man, theologian and a scientist, and was defending the theistic evolutionary position and John Mackay, the young earth creation position. And one of the questions that John Polkinghorne was asked was, do you believe Adam was a real man? And he said, no, I do not believe Adam was a real man. The name Adam just means man, and he asserted that the story in the Garden of Eden was just told to describe the nature of humanity, was to give us some insights into human nature, but that Adam himself was not a real man. And that's the position a lot of people take. But the problem with that is you get on a slippery slope. If Adam was not a real man, when does the Bible actually become real? Because there's a genealogical record in the Bible. It says who Adam's sons were and who, Seth ended up being his third son because Cain killed. But generally speaking, who the firstborn son was of each of these people within this genealogical line. And ultimately, a chronology, a date, of these events can be assigned. It's easy to calculate the date of the flood by simply adding up the ages when the male had his firstborn son. By adding these series of dates, you can easily calculate when the flood took place. But if Adam wasn't a real man, when does it become real? Because in Genesis, events progress fairly rapidly. Genesis 1 through 3 is the Garden of Eden story. The flood event is Genesis 6 through 9. And Abraham enters the picture in Genesis 11. If Genesis 1 through 3 is not real, is the flood then not real either? Or when does this history become real? That's a slippery slope you're getting on, and very, very dangerous grounds when you try to decide for yourself when the Bible is real and when it is not real. And remember, Luke himself gave the entire genealogical record as well. Luke, the physician and historian, gives the entire genealogical record all the way from Jesus to Adam. Repeats it himself. Luke believed that Adam was a real man and that this genealogical record was accurate. So, I don't know. I just don't think when you're trying to reconcile these two views together that it's really possible. Remember, evolution is an attempt to explain our world through philosophical naturalism. To explain not only the existence of world, life on earth, but ultimately our existence as well, without God. You've got to be really careful about accepting that interpretation of the world we live in from a naturalist, from a materialist, and then thinking we have to reinterpret the Bible based on that. So before we get into looking at the evidence for ape man itself, I think it's best to maybe look at some examples from history. Okay, so Nebraska man was reportedly discovered in Nebraska in 1922. Media reports of Nebraska man's discovery flooded classrooms and textbooks for several years. The Nebraska man itself was even used as evidence in the Scopes trial. So Scopes trial, if you don't know, there's a DVD by David Minton, I think, Inherit the Wind. Is it also titled Inherit the Wind? David Minton. So there's a Scopes trial was a propaganda trial put on by the American Civil Liberties Union. They put ads in the newspapers to get someone to challenge the Butler Act, which at that point in time prohibited teachers from teaching human evolution. And in any event, the Nebraska man was one of the evidences mentioned in the Scopes trial. But so this is the initial this is initial diagram of Nebraska man as was placed in the London News. But they did not have a complete skeleton of Nebraska man, a complete skull of Nebraska man, or even a complete jaw of Nebraska man. All they found was a single molar tooth. This is the actual diagram in the initial publication announcing the discovery of Nebraska man. But notice that from this initial tooth, not only can they tell what Nebraska man looked like, but his very fetching wife there next to him as well. So you get a lot of information from a tooth, when you're a paleoanthropologist. But upon full analysis, it was about 5 years later, further analysis of the Nebraska man tooth, it turned out that not only was it not an ape, that it was not a man either, but it turned out to be the tooth of an extinct pig, a peccary. So this turned out to be the tooth of an extinct pig. But it took 5 years for this data to eventually surface.
But not only have pigs been used to, or remains of pigs been used to support human evolution, it wasn't long ago, 1983, that a dolphin rib was claimed to have been the remains of an ape man as well. According to Tim White, a 5-million-year-old piece of bone that was thought to be the collarbone of a human-like creature is actually part of a dolphin rib. The problem with a lot of anthropologists, he says, is that they want so much to find a hominid that any scrap of bone becomes a hominid bone. He actually named that dolphin rib, or the discovery, Flipperpithecus. Ape men have actually been deduced from many different types of animals. Fragments of bones belonging to not only a pig and a dolphin, but also an alligator, a horse, a bear, an elephant, and a donkey have all been used. Fragments of these animals have all been found and used to support the notion of human evolution, claimed that they were the remains of ape men. According to Nigel Hawkes from the London Times, few sciences produce such abundant returns from so few fragments of fact as paleontology. And that is true. Any little fragment can be used to support one's views if interpreted in the right way. Piltdown Man was probably the next most infamous case. Piltdown Man was discovered by an amateur fossil hunter by the name of Charles Dawson in gravel pits in Piltdown, England. This is an actual photograph showing Charles Dawson in 1911. The discovery was actually announced in 1912. He announced that the missing link had been found. The discovery was published in the New York Times under the headlines, "Darwin Theories Prove True." From 1912 to 1953, Piltdown reigned supreme in classrooms, textbooks, and museums. Scores of books, pamphlets, and articles were published on Piltdown Man. But it is now recognized that this was one of the most spectacular and longest enduring frauds in history of modern science. But it took close to 50 years to uncover the truth. In 1953, science subjected the discovery to chemical analysis that proved that the jawbone was of recent origin. The teeth had been filed down to make them appear more human-like. The bones had been treated with chemicals to give them the appearance of age. Not until 1982 was collagen analysis performed on the remains that showed that it was actually the remains of orangutan. But apparently the file marks on the teeth were so obvious, many conclude that it was intentionally hid from the public as being, because if it's the only evidence you have, despite the credibility or lack thereof, it's the only evidence you have. And many people think that eventually, evolution will be overturned when the evidence no longer supports it. But you hold on to the evidence you have until other evidence surfaces. So regardless how bad the evidence is, you continue to use that evidence. But not only have fragments of bones and distortions been used to promote evolution, but probably more than anything else, it's been the propaganda that has convinced many people that human evolution is true. This was almost unquestionably, the most recognizable scientific illustration of all times. This particular diagram right here. It eventually took on the name The March of Progress. It was published originally in 1965 in a Time Life book series called Early Man by Clark Howell from the University of California. It was a library book series, but this particular diagram was sent out as a publicity tool to promote the book series. So it was an illustration that was actually in the book, and it would fold out to be a 5-page long poster. The poster itself, like I said, independently of the book, was sent out to schools and libraries across the globe. So it ended up being, this image itself was plastered in classrooms across the country, and it was one of these enduring images. Despite the lack of evidence to support it, imagery itself is very, very powerful. Yeah, I don't know if my dad really believed in evolution, because I was raised in a Christian home, but I know the name Australopithecus afarensis from my father. For whatever reason, I think he was impressed enough about some of this human evolution stuff that he knew the name Australopithecus afarensis, and I know that name just from him. But one of the problems with this particular diagram is the fact that it is blatantly fictitious. But even Stephen Jay Gould remarks about the impression that it has made upon the populace. He described the March of Progress as a canonical representation of evolution, the one picture immediately grasped and viscerally understood by all. The diagram itself has been reproduced countless times, parodied countless times, but as I said, the diagram was knowingly fictitious. The author itself, in fine print on the back of the poster itself, says that although proto-apes and apes were quadrupedal, which means they walked on all four, all are shown here standing for comparison. But note they're not shown standing, they're shown walking. That's why it became known as the March of Progress. It was pure propaganda and brilliantly successful. Diagrams like this, probably more than the evidence alone, probably more than that fragmentary fossil evidence, convinced most of the American population, at least, that human evolution was in fact true. Stephen Jay Gould criticized the diagram, but not for the fact that it contained apes that were known to not walk upright within the diagram, but for misrepresenting evolution itself as, instead of being a linear advance, should be displayed as a branching bush. So he had criticisms to make about it, but not for the fictitious nature of the diagram, but for the fact that it didn't illustrate evolution as being a branching bush, continually pruned by the grim reaper of extinction. It's not a ladder of predictable progress. But what are the distinctions between humans and apes? They are significant. This is, again, a diagram that I pulled from Prentice Hall Biology, just showing the distinctions that are laid out that characterize humans versus apes. Those shown here are specifically the differences that cause humans to walk upright and apes to walk on all fours. Apes are knuckle walkers. They're quadrupeds. They walk on their knuckles. Their wrists lock into place, and they walk along on their knuckles. Here is their list of characteristics. All of these human characteristics allow us to walk upright. We have a fine sense of balance given to us by the semicircular canal within the ear that enables us to walk on 2 feet. The flat nature of the face itself allows us to view the field from that position rather than walking down on all fours on the ground. The upright skull itself is the skull itself is positioned on the spinal cord to give us an outward view as well. The straight back, the fully extendable femur bones, the fully extendable knee joints, allowing us to have the successful gait. The very long legs, the arched feet and strong big toes, again, very necessary for bipedal growth. The differences between apes and humans are significant. And generally speaking, there are 2 different genera that apes and humans are classified into. So taxonomically, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right there. So there are genus is one taxonomic level above species level, and there are 2 main genera that ape men are classified into, if you will. The Australopithecines, the genus Australopithecus, and the genus Homo. Now notice again the March of Progress diagram reproduced here one more time. But according to creationists, generally what you're looking at here are true apes, all assigned to the genus Australopithecus, and true humans that are assigned to the genus Homo. So that would include Homo sapiens, our own species, those known as Neanderthals, and Homo erectus. Homo habilis is placed here in the middle because most creationists today, and even many secular paleontologists, view it to be a hodgepodge or a collection of ape and human fossils. The fact is that there is still today an unbridgeable gap between apes and humans, not only morphologically or in appearance and physical structure, but in the fossil record as well. Now, I should point out that there are many more species than are listed in this diagram today. You have Homo ergaster is today argued to be a Homo erectus that was unique to Africa. There's Homo Homo heidelbergensis, Homo floresiensis, rudolfensis, and the list goes on and on. There are a great many human species that are categorized into the genus Homo. But within paleontology, paleoanthropology today, there are really two groups of people called the lumpers and the splitters. The lumpers want to put all the Homo species into one species. Homo sapien, maybe subspecies, but they want to lump them all together. The splitters want every single minor difference that they find to be a new species. And today, being a splitter is very advantageous because no one wants to find the 300th Homo erectus bone, but you are famous and on the cover of the popular media magazines or on the news if you claim to have found a new human species. So if you claim to find something new, something that answers or causes us to rethink human evolution, you're on the front page. So there are splitters around for good reason that it's very advantageous to one's career to be such. But there is an unbridgeable gap. There are apes and there are humans and nothing in between. Those are all still missing links. Even Zuckerman, a professor of anatomy at Birmingham University in England, points this out. He says, for example, no scientist would logically dispute the proposition that man, without having been involved in any act of divine creation, evolved from some ape-like creature in a very short space of time, speaking in geological terms, without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation. Today, the missing links are still missing. So where did these ape men come from? These are the ways you can make an ape man. Okay? You either combine fossils of apes with fossils of humans and make a true ape man. Like many of these. Or you can emphasize the human-like qualities of fossilized apes. You find a fossilized ape and you emphasize human-like qualities of that. You claim that they walk upright, or you do the exact opposite. You can emphasize the ape-like qualities of human fossils and claim that it was more ape, and claim that these human fossils were more ape-like. But generally speaking, you can point to one of these three as being the method that was used to claim that any particular fossil is itself an intermediate between apes and humans. So we're going to look at three main ape men examples. Well, Australopithecines, Neanderthals, and Homo erectus in some detail. Okay? But this is probably the best opportunity we have to take a break. And so let's do that now. Come back and keep going. Let me start with the prayer, okay? I always do it at the very beginning, and I fail to. I find that these talks always go so much better if I get you guys to pray for me. Okay, would you mind? While I just send us up a little bit of praise. Father, we thank you so much. Father, as we reflect upon your creation itself and what you've done for us, it's truly humbling, Father. We just want to tell you how much we love you, Father. We love you and praise you for being the creator of the universe, for being our Father that looks down upon us continually, watches over us, for sending your Son, Jesus. We praise you for these things, Father. Glory is yours, Father. We lift up your name and we praise you. Father, be with us today as we examine some evidence that's being used to prove that you did not create us, Father, and that you're not our Lord, Father. We just ask for wisdom and understanding, Father. I'd ask that you fill me with your Spirit. Give me the words. Give me the articulate speech, Father. Just come and join us today, Father. In Christ's name, amen. All right, thanks, you guys. All right, so again, how do you create an ape man? Well, we'll start back here again. So we can combine ape fossils with human fossils like they did doing with Homo habilis and some of these others and create an ape man by combining the two. You can emphasize the human-like qualities of fossilized apes, emphasize ape-like qualities of fossilized humans, and that's how you get ape man. And most of the ones that are being used today are just that. Now, some of them are actually just humans, so like I said, the Australopithecines, Your genus Australopithecus, the Australopithecines, all just real true apes. The genus Homo is comprised really of true humans. But what they do is they emphasize the human-like qualities of Australopithecines, make claims about them that they walked upright and these kind of things, or they emphasize the ape-like qualities of the Homo fossils, the ancient human fossils that they find, emphasize ape-like qualities of those, and in doing so try to bridge the gap, the tremendous gap that exists between apes and humans. So Australopithecines, if you remember, is a genus of claimed human ancestors. Now, the most popular, the best known of these is Lucy. She was discovered in 1974 in Ethiopia, claimed to be about 40% complete, but actually closer to 20%. They're just not counting the hands and feet. She was dated to be about 3 million years ago. She was claimed to walk upright. The name itself, Lucy, consequently was given to her because apparently during the night following her discovery, they were playing the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds over the camp louds in the camp, and so someone decided to call her Lucy. But I find it most humorous that the song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was really about LSD, was really about acid. So she was apparently named after an acid hallucination of some sort. I think that's what that... Anyway, I don't know. There are several reconstructions of Lucy have been made. You can find them almost in any museum dealing with human evolution. Here's a reconstruction in the Las Vegas Natural History Museum. Here's another one at the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico. The Lucy exhibit, there was a Lucy exhibit that came to the Pacific Science Center in Seattle recently. I took my entire creation apologetics class. In addition to teaching biology, chemistry, human anatomy and physiology, life science, I also teach a year-long class at our Christian high school on creation apologetics. And this was my creation apologetics class back in 2009. I'm the pretty one back there in the back, and these guys are all troublemakers. But I took them all to the Lucy exhibit, which was very eye-opening in a number of ways. I think one of the things that struck me the most about the Lucy exhibit was that in order for Lucy to be able to go on tour, they required that the exhibit also contain historical information about Ethiopia. So about half of the exhibit on Lucy was about Ethiopia, historical evidence, Ethiopia, and almost all of that was the Christian heritage of Ethiopia, which I thought was pretty cool. It's like they almost wanted to make sure that that was in there. And there was some amazing things. There were churches that were carved completely out of stone. I mean, just carved directly into rock. It was amazing stuff. Okay, back on topic, though. So here we go. That's what teachers do. They kind of follow rabbits every once in a while, but... So, if you'll notice from the diagram that the Lucy itself had no hands and feet were discovered. Only a couple of small fragments of hand bones were discovered. It had no hands and feet originally, but the models that you always see of Lucy have given it very human-like hands and feet. And the model at the Lucy exhibit had very human-like hands and feet. The toe was slightly apart from the big toe was slightly apart from the others, but still very, very much in line with them and had a very much human-like quality to it. But you look at the hand as well, where the hand is positioned, a very human-like hand, and you know, a look on its face like it's pondering its fate or future discoveries. Doesn't it have a very much, yeah. So it had very, human-like finger and toes. That are the models. They're straight human-like finger and toes. They're clearly human-like. But prior to the creation of this model and the exhibit at the Pacific Science Center, it had already other Australopithecus afarensis fossils had been discovered with bones on the hands and feet, and it was already well known by this point that they did not have human-like hands and feet. They were very much ape-like, designed for knuckle walking and life in the trees. One of the most substantial studies was done by Stern and Sussman in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology in 1983. They concluded, now Stern and Sussman believed that Lucy was an intermediate between Australopithecus and modern Homo sapiens, and they believed that they did walk on the ground fairly extensively, but they made some comments regarding their hands and feet that are very telling. They said a summary of the morphological and functional affinities of one of these Australopithecus hand fossils leads inexorably to an image of suspensory, hanging, adapted hand, surprisingly similar to the hands found in the small end of the pygmy chimpanzee, common chimpanzee range. So they had hands like a pygmy chimpanzee that are designed for hanging, for suspensory movement. They continue, there is no evidence that any extant or living primate has long, curved, heavily muscled hands and feet for any purpose other than to meet the demands of full or part-time arboreal life or life in the trees. In an article titled Lucy on the Ground with Knuckles, again a play on the Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds thing, the researchers in the Science News stated that Australopithecus anamensis and afarensis, the latter represented by the famous skeleton known as Lucy, had wrists capable of locking in place and during knuckle walking. So their hands were clearly designed for suspensory life in the trees, and when on the ground, they locked in place for knuckle walking. Other anatomical features of Lucy are clearly ape-like, not human-like, and designed for tree life in the trees. The shoulder socket as well of afarensis is sharply angled. In humans, it is vertically oriented. This indicates that Lucy lived more of a tree lifestyle than on the ground. The shoulder was more suited for brachiation, which is basically swinging from branch to branch in the trees. That's what its shoulder was clearly designed for. Its pelvis was also not similar to humans, but more similar to the chimp. The iliac blade in humans goes back to front, whereas in apes, the iliac blade in the pelvis flares out laterally. The difference between humans and apes is specifically due to the upright nature of human locomotion. Stern and Sussman comment on this as well. The fact that the anterior portion of the iliac blade faces laterally in humans but not in chimpanzees is obvious. The marked resemblance of Lucy to the chimpanzee is equally obvious. It suggests to us that the mechanism of lateral pelvic balance during bipedalism was closer to that in apes than in humans. So their hands were very ape-like, designed for living in the trees and knuckle walking on the ground. But as well, their pelvis was that of a quadruped as well, not of a bipedal like ourselves. So what do you do if you have a fossil that does not walk upright and you want a fossil that walks upright? One of the things you can do is you can take your fossil and with some careful reconstructive surgery, you can make it walk upright. Now, I'm being a bit facetious here, but not entirely. In a 1994 PBS Nova series documentary titled In Search of Human Origins, it features some of the work done by Dr. Owen Lovejoy, who's the chairman of anthropology at Kent State University. So watch this video, and it'll show you one of the things that paleoanthropologists do to get their fossils to say what they want them to say.
The ape that stood up. It was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossilization.
So it had a pelvis similar to a chimpanzee's that could not walk upright, and instead of accepting the evidence that was before him, there's one more video. So instead of accepting the evidence that was before him, they decided that the pelvis must have been broken and then fused back together during fossilization. So in the beginning of this next clip, what you're going to see is the pelvis being broken by like a deer or something stepping on it, which then was later refossilized.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost. Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Okay, well, clearly when the skull of Lucy was examined, Lucy does not have a human-like skull either. One of the major differences between an ape skull and a human skull is that humans have a very flat face. Apes have a very much protruding jaw, and that's the kind of what they call a shovel face, and that's what Lucy has. She also has canine teeth that come in at an angle, unlike humans. The cranial capacity is even smaller than a typical ape, and as well the nasal bones. It doesn't have the nasal bones that humans possess. So there are very few qualities that Lucy has that are similar to modern humans. Also, the point of attachment of the skull to the spine is even further back than it is in chimps. This fossa right here, this hole is where the spine attaches to the skull. Notice where it is in Lucy and then where it is in chimps. So Lucy was clearly a quadruped, a knuckle walker, wasn't able to walk upright as is typically claimed. The jaw is also more similar to the chimps than in humans, as you'll note there. They also did not have the balance capabilities that are necessary for bipedal growth. They're missing the semicircular canal for balance that humans have. Theirs is more typical of apes, like typical of knuckle walkers. Also notice the position of the external ear, the ear hole right there is much more similar to apes than it is in humans. Montague, who is an expert on Australopithecine anatomy and who had taught at Harvard, Princeton, Rutgers, University of California, and New York University, stated that the skull form of all Australopithecines is extremely ape-like. The Australopithecines show too many specialized and ape-like characteristics to be either the direct ancestor of man or to the line that led to man. Zuckerman also had, Lord Zuckerman also had some very strong words to say about the similarity between Australopithecines and the human skull. He said, I myself remain totally unpersuaded. Almost always when I've tried to check the anatomical claims of which the status of Australopithecus is based, I have ended in failure. The Australopithecine skull is in fact so overwhelmingly simian as opposed to human that the contrary proposition could be equated to an assertion that black is white. It's about like asserting that black is white. But like I say, propaganda speaks volumes. When the Australopithecine skull was reconstructed for National Geographic magazine in 1996, this is the illustration that was produced. Do you see any features on this that appear clearly human-like? Yeah, the eyes. Most people mention the eyes as being very human-like, and they are. In apes, you actually don't see the whites of their eyes. The visible whites of the eyes, that's a distinctly human characteristic. So what do you do when you want to make an ape man? You emphasize the human-like qualities of ape-like fossils, and that's what is done. The artist that actually created this admitted as much. I wanted to get a human soul into this ape-like face to indicate something about where she was headed. That's what they do. The models aren't just an accurate reproduction of what was found. They add to that where they believe the creature is actually going or coming from, if it's a human fossil. To summarize, Australopithecines have characteristics that are clearly ape-like, closer to chimpanzees than in humans. They have long arms, identical to chimpanzees. Their jaws are similar to chimpanzees, as are the upper leg bone. The brain size overlaps with chimpanzees, somewhere between 450 cubic centimeters. They have large back muscles for tree dwelling. They had hands similar to pygmy chimpanzees that had very ape-like foot, fingers and toes that were long and curved. They had locking wrists for knuckle walking, and they had an ankle bone that was angled for tree dwelling. Charles Oxnard said that Australopithecines have been removed from the lineage leading to humans. The Australopithecines, according to Charles Oxnard, Origin of Man, said that have been known for the last several decades are now irrevocably removed from the place in the evolution of human bipedalism, possibly from a place in a group any closer to humans than to African apes, and certainly from any place in the direct human lineage. But his comments may be somewhat naive, because until they have better evidence to replace Australopithecines, they will remain as our ancestor that bridges the gap between humans and apes. So let's look at Neanderthals. Neanderthals were named because they were first discovered, or actually one of the first fossils discovered was discovered in the Neander Valley in Germany in 1956. This is one of the original drawings that was made of Neanderthal. It was originally believed to look very ape-like. It's believed to have lived somewhere between 600,000 years ago and at 30, even as recent as 20,000 years ago, so very recent in evolutionary geological timelines. But one of the things you do, again, is if you have a human-like fossil, you emphasize the ape-like qualities of that. And one of the ways they do that is by positioning the jaw. In most fossils, fossils of the skull, all they have usually is the skull cap and the lower bone of the jaw. Those are the jawbone is one big piece, but there are many, many bones in the face. So those tend to be broken. The face itself tends to be broken apart. And then the skull cap itself fuses together very well during development, and that tends to remain as a solid piece. So they usually just have the skull cap and the lower jawbone. And what they do with the skull cap and the lower jawbone, they figure out where that jaw might fit against that skull cap based on their assumptions. Because if the jawbone is further in, you have a flat face very similar to the humans. If the jawbone is further out, you have a face much more ape-like. And that's what they'll do. In Jack Cuozzo's book, Buried Alive, Jack Cuozzo, they have the book back there, he actually got permission to examine Neanderthal fossils in several museums in France and in Germany. He actually went there with a miniature X-ray machine and was able to take X-rays of some of these. I don't know how he managed to get in, but he was a retired orthodontist. But one of the things that he saw when doing this was, this is actually a graphic that he obtained at the souvenir counter at the museum in Berlin of a Neanderthal skull. And being a retired orthodontist, knowing human anatomy, facial anatomy very well, one of the things he realized right away was that the jawbone itself was out of socket. The jawbone itself, this process, this extension on the jawbone, fits into a socket on the skull called a fossa, and he realized that this jawbone in this diagram was intentionally distorted, positioned out of socket by close to 30 centimeters to make it look more ape-like. If you compare this diagram at the museum at Berlin to to more modern reproductions or diagrams of Neanderthal skulls, notice the difference. This is a more modern Neanderthal skull diagram and the one that he encountered at the museum in Berlin. I mean, that's what they do. They distort it by positioning the jaw outward. Most of your reproductions today, your models, reconstructions of Neanderthals look very, very human-like. These are two models at the Neanderthal Museum in Germany. Now, the Neanderthals were big game hunters. They lived in very cold, harsh climates. And we know they're big game hunters because we find them with trophies of the game that they hunted mammoths and these kind of things. But they lived in very cold, harsh climates just south of the 50th parallel where the glaciers extended. So glaciation, we know that they lived during the Ice Age, and they lived just beyond the glacier advance. So glaciers literally had come down all this way, and the Neanderthals lived just beneath it. And Neanderthal fossils have been found over this specific range, outlined in green right here. Okay, so very harsh climates. The characteristics of Neanderthals, very similar to Homo erectus, actually. They had very thick skulls, thick bones in the skull, what they call robust skulls. So the bones in the skull were very, very thick, and they also had brow ridges. So they had a distinct ridge over their brow, and they had more of a tapering forehead than modern humans have. Okay, so those are the major characteristics, but they were also very stocky, kind of shorter extremities, very stocky, shorter extremities. No, those are the basic characteristics of Neanderthal. Anthropologist Eric Tinkus at the University of Washington is an expert in Neanderthal biology and human evolution. He concluded that detailed comparison of Neanderthal skeleton remains with those of modern humans have shown that there is nothing in Neanderthal anatomy that conclusively indicates locomotor, manipulative, intellectual, or linguistic abilities inferior to those of modern humans. They were, for all intents and purposes, modern humans. But there is still much debate today about how they fit into human origins. V. Sodera is a human anatomist with 3 books on surgical techniques. He concluded that despite their stocky body build and their stocky skull shape, there is no hard evidence to say that Neanderthals were in any way inferior intellectually to modern humans. They are known to have made sophisticated flint tools, built huts out of animal skins, and had control of fire. They also buried their dead. In the Journal of Creation, Marvin Lubenow, who published the book Bones of Contention, which is back there on the table as well, also remarks about Neanderthal burial sites and what they suggest. Most anthropologists, he says, recognize burial as very human and a very religious act. But the strongest evidence that Neanderthals were fully human and of our own species is that at 4 sites, Neanderthals and modern humans were found buried together. So they've actually found Neanderthals and modern humans buried together. Most of the reconstructions today, as I've said already, have look very, very human-like. Here's another reconstruction at the Neanderthal Museum in Germany. Here's one of the famous Gibraltar child that was discovered in 1926. Very human-like. Their initial reconstructions are now known to have been incredibly wrong. Not only were they not ape-like, they were very much human-like. 100% human. The brain capacity was even larger than ours, about 200 cc's larger on average. We know they used jewelry. We know they used musical instruments. They did cave paintings. Actually, this month there was an article, a new article that came out about some Neanderthal cave paintings that were just discovered. And we know that they buried their dead. But how they fit into human evolution is still heavily debated. The theories with regard to how Australopithecines fit into Neanderthal Homo erectus have changed dramatically over time. This is a diagram that I took out of the Journal of Creation by Bill Merritt. And notice the arrangement here from 1955 with Australopithecus evolving into Homo erectus, which then you had Neanderthals split off and become a separate species from Homo sapiens. In 1967, it had been concluded that Neanderthals have evolved from Homo erectus, and they evolved eventually into Homo sapiens, so that Neanderthals were our direct ancestor. By 1971, Neanderthals had been once again removed from being our direct ancestor, as had Homo erectus. And now Homo habilis had instead evolved into Homo sapiens. By 1980, it had changed again, where Homo habilis had changed into Homo erectus, which then became Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals were at that point considered the same species as Homo sapiens. They were renamed Homo sapiens neanderthalis. But that has changed again. Neanderthals are now considered to be a separate species from Homo sapiens, and now they're back to being called Homo neanderthalis. So things have just changed dramatically through time. And the same holds true for Homo erectus, their actual place in human evolution. But we'll look at Homo erectus briefly. Homo erectus was first discovered in 1891 by Eugene Dubois. This was the first Homo erectus that was found. It's kind of an interesting story behind the whole thing. It was called Java because it was found in Java Island, which is an island in Indonesia, if memory serves correct. Eugene Dubois was the first person to ever intentionally set out to try to find evidence of human evolution. He was a former student of Ernest Haeckel, who was better known for, he was the popular evolutionist of his day, better known for the embryos. He had constructed proof of evolution by way of showing that the embryos of various vertebrates all looked identical at a certain stage of development. And only recently, like within the last 10 years, an analysis of those embryonic stages proved conclusively that Haeckel's embryos were all fakes, that he had distorted the evolution terribly. But so Eugene Dubois, former student of Haeckel, set out to find the ape man that Haeckel believed to have existed, and originally called it Pithecanthropus, which was what Ernest Haeckel originally had named it. So he eventually called it, if I remember, let's see if I got my note, Pithecanthropus erectus is what Eugene Dubois first called the specimens that he had found. And this is an actual picture showing the skull cap and the femur bone and a single tooth that Eugene Dubois had found. So he found a single skull cap and a tooth much later. The femur bone was found about a year later and about 50 feet away. The skull cap itself was very robust, very, very thick, and had a heavy brow ridge. And at the time it was discovered, there was heavy debate amongst paleontologists as to whether it was human at all. Many concluded that it was just an ape skull, probably an extinct ape. And that it belonged to the femur is questioned even today. The femur itself is very much modern human-like. The bones are much thinner in comparison to the thick bones of the skull cap. So whether or not the two belong together was debated for some time. But that the skull cap was an ancient human was finally put to rest with the discovery of Peking man. Peking man was discovered in the early 1920s. Between 1923 and 1927, several fossils had been found. Initially just a tooth. But they realized they were digging at an ancient human site because they first found quartz that weren't native to the site. So they started digging, intentionally trying to find ancient human artifacts, found a tooth in the very beginning, work continued there, and then eventually found several specimens. But I was kind of astonished, probably more than anything, with the entrance to the cave system. This is a huge sculpture of Peking man in the entry of the cave system where these fossils were discovered. I mean, it's almost like ancestry worship, in a way. I mean, that's almost how paleoanthropologists view our ancestors. I mean, actually, I wonder what one of these fellows would think if they came back and saw, you know, one of their bones that had been, I don't know, made into a huge shrine like this. I don't know. It's very telling. But they ended up finding about 6 complete skull caps in this cave system. And Beijing used to be called Peking, and so that's why it's called Peking man. But they eventually found 6 skull caps, but they have all been lost. It was a tragic mishap. The digs at the site had to be shut down during the early parts of World War II. Japan had invaded, and they had to shut down activity at the dig site. And eventually, they became concerned that the skull caps that they had found would be lost, and they decided to ship them to U.S. for safekeeping. And at some point during the transit, there's a lot of debate about what actually happened to them. They were apparently turned over to some U.S. soldiers who were then to transport them down for shipping. And at some point between, they disappeared. They're not sure. There's some debate about where they were locked up and for how long. The soldiers ended up in an internment camp, but the fossils were lost. Okay, and I've heard it being criticized that it was an act of fraud. But Clearly not. I think there's no reason to doubt at this point that Homo erectus was, just like Neanderthal, an ancient human. Okay? And, you know, it's a tragic loss, but you can see some distortions done that try to make Homo erectus look more ape-like. I found this graphic off of Wikipedia, which on their Homo erectus page, well, I can't remember if I got up the Homo erectus page or the Peking man page, to say the truth at this point. But this is an actual diagram of Peking man, which itself was, again, a Homo erectus. And notice the position of the jaw in comparison to the skull. Again, very much extended forward to make that look more ape-like. Whereas, remember, humans had a very much flat face, and Homo erectus did as well. Most of the reconstructions, the models of Homo erectus at this point, again, look very much human-like. The distinguishing characteristics are, you know, fairly substantial, mostly due to the robust nature of the skull. Marvin Lubenow, in the book Bones of Contention, which I highly recommend, I know she has some copies back there, he lists all of the characteristics that can be used to distinguish Homo erectus from modern Homo sapiens, but all of those are pretty much the thickness of the bones in the skull. They had really, really thick bones in the skull. The cranial capacity is also slightly different. The cranial capacity, meaning how much space there was for the brain in the skull. The cranial capacity of Homo erectus was between 780 cubic centimeters and 1275, whereas in modern humans it ranges between 700 and 2200 cubic centimeters, so it's a bit larger. Modern humans had a bit larger of a cranial capacity, but otherwise, the characteristics here, that cranial capacity, as well as much of the other characteristics, fall within the range of modern humans. But how close they were was unknown until a fairly recent investigation was done. In 1994, researchers compared Homo erectus skulls with that of 4 modern humans. And the Australian Aborigines were one of these. Australian Aborigines today, as several other people groups, still have thick brow ridges. And when they compared some of the skull traits of Homo erectus with some of these 4 separate modern living populations, they found significant overlap. And they concluded that now that comparable data is available, it appears that if Homo sapiens include all the people alive today in the world, their ancestors in the late Pleistocene, and those called archaic Homo sapiens, then vault thickness, the thickness of the skull, of the bones in the skull, cannot be used to distinguish Homo erectus from Homo sapiens. So although their bones in their skull are thicker, they're not substantially thicker, and because we find modern Homo sapiens with skulls equally as thick, we cannot use that specifically as a way of distinguishing a skull as specifically Homo erectus. So at this point, the distinction between those two is somewhat blurred. Another discovery in 2008 revealed that the skulls of newborns were probably much, much closer to that of modern Homo sapiens than was previously thought. This is an actual National Science Foundation diagram published in 2008 that shows how close the cranial, the pelvis region was, how similar the cranial capacity, the size of the skull of the newborn was of Homo erectus in comparison to modern humans. Very, very, very close. We also know that Homo erectus made tools. Much like Neanderthal, there was a lot of tool used there. The most common tool found with Homo erectus is the hand axe. And I mention this more than anything because I found it kind of interesting. So, unfortunately, that's what you do. The stuff that you find interesting, you hope other people will find interesting, and I found this kind of interesting. So, this is what the hand axe kind of looked like, and this is the area where you find Homo erectus. Pretty much everywhere they found Homo erectus, they have found these hand axes. And the darkened area here on this map shows where they have found Homo erectus populations with hand axes. Okay? And there's a great big statue of a Homo erectus site in England where they had found hand axes. But this is what they look like. Here's a number of hand axes. They varied in size and shape. And they're called hand axes because for the longest time, it was thought that they had been used as a hand axe. That you actually held it in your hand and then you axed on stuff. Because they're about the size of a hand and it seems like it would fit for that purpose. But one of the controversies around them is that they have been beveled or sharpened all the way around. That's kind of a consistent characteristic of them. although there's kind of a flattened edge, there's a pointed edge, and there's kind of a more rounded edge, they're sharpened all the way around. And if you were going to use that as a hand tool, you definitely wouldn't do that. You would have one end that was very much rounded off. Or if you were going to attach it to some implement, axe handle or some piece of bone or something to use it as an actual axe, you would have one end that was very blunted, okay? And so there's a bit of a mystery as to what they were actually used for. It has been argued that they were, that they're actually the cores that are left behind from making flints, or if you were making like arrowheads or something, you would be chipping away pieces, and some have argued that these are simply the left behind cores for making other stuff. But there's a very, very consistent architecture to the things, and it appears clear that they were a tool that was used for some purpose. Marvin Lubenow, in his book Bones of Contention, argued, and I saw a couple other publications that made the same assertion, that they were actually probably used as a projectile for either hunting or for war. But it was a projectile that was probably thrown, one said frisbee-like. Marvin Lubenow asserted that it was probably thrown discus-like, that you held it on the rounded end and you threw it like a discus when you were hunting or during war times. And he made a very interesting point that probably would explain the origin of the discus as a competition. You know, most of the competitive events in these games were based on hunting or wartime prowesses of some sort, things that you would do. But that discus is a very odd event in itself, unless it had some purpose originally. I don't know. I found that kind of cool. So let me kind of get into this as I kind of work my way to a closure. I want to try my best to summarize who these peoples were. Who were the Neanderthals and Homo erectus? Now, I should point out, much like the theories related to the Neanderthals have changed dramatically through time. The theories related to the Homo erectus have changed even more dramatically and even more puzzling. There are two main theories regarding Homo erectus evolution, okay, known as the multi-regional theory and the out-of-Africa theory. It's two main theories, and the original was called the multi-regional theory. Now, Homo erectus have been found in Africa, Europe, Southern Asia, Australia, okay? But this was the original theory, that Homo erectus eventually evolved from some ape-like ancestor like Homo habilis or Homo ergaster back in Africa. So perhaps Homo habilis or Homo ergaster evolved into Homo erectus in Africa. These Homo erectus then migrated to various regions like, so they stayed in Africa, some migrated to Asia, some migrated to areas in Europe, some migrated to Australia, and that these eventually evolved into modern Homo sapiens in these regions. Okay, that was the original theory, long-standing theory, but now there's been a major shift towards what's called the out-of-Africa theory. So both theories say that Homo erectus evolved in Africa, okay? And then the multi-regional theory says that Homo erectus evolved into modern Homo sapiens in those various regions. Okay? The out-of-Africa theory differs like this. So the multi-regional theory, just to show you again, so this is Africa, and these are various regions. So Homo erectus eventually evolved in Africa, migrated to the various regions, and continued to evolve over long periods of time into Homo sapiens. Okay? The out-of-Africa theory works like this. So first, Homo erectus evolved in Africa, migrated to these various regions, but then all of these Homo erectus populations either died out or something, and the population that was in Africa continued to evolve into modern Homo sapiens, and then they migrated to those various regions, and the peoples that exist there now are Homo sapiens that all evolved in Africa, and the Homo erectus populations that were there either went extinct, were killed off, or perhaps even were maybe assimilated. Okay? Very, very odd, puzzling, don't you think? That such a theory would surface. So Peking man, although in their reconstruction looks very Asian-like, and so Peking man is not the ancestor of modern Asians. It's very puzzling. But Marvin Lubenow, again, Bones of Contention, argued that the justification for this theory has but one purpose and one purpose alone, and that's to try to distance evolution from racism. Because the original theory of evolution was used by racists for generations to support horrible atrocities, like to the Australian Aborigines. They believe that they were very, very subhuman, and they were able to justify acts of genocide against them. As well, some of the African populations, the treatments of slaves, thought that they were subhuman, could not be educated because they thought they had not evolved enough. Okay? But so he believes that this theory was set up basically to try to distance evolution from this racist racial overtones that it has always had. And so by having Homo sapiens, the population of Homo sapiens that now exist in Africa are all descended from one population. They're all at the same stage of evolutionary development. Whereas if evolution happens at different rates, then this population or this population over here maybe just didn't evolve as much yet as this one, as this one, as this one. You get it? It's kind of weird, but that's kind of where the current thinking is. You might remember the Africa Eve, the mitochondrial Eve studies that were done. That's what all that was about. The mitochondrial Eve studies were studies to support this out of Africa theory, that all human populations have now descended very recently from one population of Homo sapiens that evolved in Africa, not related to either the Neanderthals or the Homo erectus populations that are now found in Europe and these other places. Okay, but regardless, Marvin Lubenow shows in his book, this is one of the diagrams in his book, that that the whole theory of evolution really comes crashing down as far as humans are concerned, because modern Homo sapiens have been found alongside all of these others anyway. I mean, for this theory to stand on its own, modern humans should not appear until very, very late. But he has shown that modern humans have been found alongside Homo erectus. Several Homo erectus grave sites have been found that have modern Homo sapien types fossils there as well. You have the big robust skulls, and right along beside them, the very gray cell skulls. The thin skulls of modern Homo sapiens are found right there along with them. And as well with Neanderthals. I mean, modern Homo sapiens are found buried with Neanderthals. And as well, Australopithecines, that modern Homo sapiens have been found all alongside these. And so when the fossil evidence is really examined, the theory itself just does not have much to stand on. So from the creationist point of view, it's best, I think, to conclude, and most of the creationists support this, that these populations, these Neanderthals and Homo erectus, were peoples that lived after the flood. Okay, during the post-flood period, during that Ice Age period, that's when the Neanderthals occupied that region just below the glacial advances, that these were probably just post-flood populations of humans. Okay, so Marvin Lubenow concludes, this is actually a quote from The Bones of Contention, which I highly recommend, a very, very thorough analysis of the subject of human origin. He concludes that, based on his own conclusion, that Homo erectus and Neanderthals are actually the same. Homo erectus is at the lower end with regard to size of a continuum that includes Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals. The range of cranial capacities for fossil humans is in line with the range of cranial capacities for modern humans. So he actually asserts that they're the same. One is just slightly larger than the other. Peter Line in Journal of Creation asserts basically the same. Without the burden of having to fit fossils into an evolutionary scheme, there is no reason not to accept fossils, such as those categorized as erectus and Neanderthals, as belonging to one humankind. If fossils such as those categorized as Homo erectus and Neanderthals were all fully human, then the case for human evolution essentially collapses, and there's an unbridgeable morphological gap between Australopithecine apes and these humans. So, how do we explain the differences in morphology? How do we explain the differences in their physical features, the thick skulls and these kind of things? Is there any real explanation for these? Well, several things have been put forth. Just that the fact that there was greater genetic diversity in the past is very, very significant. The human genetic diversity has decreased dramatically over time. They were living under very harsh conditions. That post-flood ice age was a very, very harsh time. That could have a great effect. Their dietary habits being very poor at that time, having to rely specifically on hunting, haven't established cultures yet where there was farming, where they had diverse diets, would lead to nutrient deficiencies. Stress of particular biomechanical forces refers to the fact that during this time, their jaw and or their teeth was the primary tool that was used by these peoples. When you had to hold something, when you had to cut something, when you had to grasp something more rigidly than your hands could handle, you would hold those with your teeth. You would cut things with your teeth, you break things apart with your teeth, that their teeth and their jaws was a primary tool use, and these forces, this extra stress put on these bones would cause them to become fortified. Your bones are constantly being remodeled. Your bones are not the same bones you had 2 years ago. You have cells in your bones that break away bones and other cells that rebuild them. Osteoclast, osteoblast, build new bone cells. Osteoclast break away, eat away at bones, so your bones are constantly remodeled. And the stresses that you place upon them determine how they're reshaped. And so if your jaws were being used as tools, those bones themselves would end up becoming much more fortified by these processes. Also longevity. The actual human lifespan, very, very significant. Remember that before the flood, people lived to be 800-900 years old. And they continue to live very, very long lifespans after the flood. Okay? And bones continue to develop throughout your life. So here's your longevity scale from Adam all the way down to King Solomon. By the time of Moses, the lifespans had fallen to where they are today, which is the maximum of 120 years. When God decided to destroy the world by flood, one of the things he mentioned was that man should not live but to 120 years. And it's my view, although not accepted by all, that what he was mentioning was the reduction in human life expectancy that would follow the flood. Because that is it. 120 years is the maximum human life expectancy. That's how long Moses lived, and pretty much everyone since then. That's pretty much the limit. But there's the flood, and you see people's lived considerably longer, still several hundred years for many, many, many generations after the flood. So it's these longevities. How would a person's skull look who had lived to be 500 years old? And when you find this person buried alongside someone who was born later and only lived to be 70 years, you find someone with a 500-year-old skull and someone with a 70-year-old skull buried right there together. That's your explanation for Homo erectus population being found right there along with modern Homo sapiens. They weren't separate species. They lived right there together, so this is very, very significant. So in closing, I think we can say conclusively, or we can argue very strongly that the gap between apes and humans is still as wide as it ever was, that those missing links are still missing, and that this famous march of progress is very much as fictitious today as it was in the beginning. That we can rely upon the Bible, where it says that, where God said, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. Let's go to the Father one last time. Father, we just thank you so much again that you have sent us your word. The insight and the understanding that we can gain by studying your word and applying that knowledge to the world that we live in is something we thank you very much for. Father, we need wisdom. We need wisdom to understand the teachings that are out there that are coming to us. Please help us to gain the understanding to recognize truth when we hear it, to recognize misinformation that we hear it, and to gain the knowledge that is necessary to teach those that are around us. Father, send people to us that need to hear the truth of creation that we possess. Father, give us the words to articulate these views. Send your Spirit to us and fill us and allow us to be the servant you would call us to be. Father, we thank you and we praise you. We love you, Christ Jesus. In his name, amen. You got to pick and choose. Recent DNA studies have shown that modern humans are very closely related to Neanderthals. So for some of these, there's just not a whole lot of DNA information available, but it's an interesting subject to look into. True.
And one of the factors that you passed over briefly but I think it's an important one, is that during our lifetimes, certain parts of our body continue to develop, like our nose, our ears, and in Jack Quozo's book, he makes the point that the jaw moves forward. So in addition to the fact that they actually moved it forward on the skulls that they displayed, it does move forward some as we get older. If we lived over 400 years, then that could seriously distort that part of the anatomy. But another thing I'm wondering about that came to me as we're watching there, do you have any information about whether the brow ridge develops further with age also?
Well, I mean, the bones in the skull generally continue to thicken throughout your life. So the longer you live, the more those are going to thicken. But it's not just the brow ridge that's different in some of these ancient humans, but the forehead itself is very much more sloped. So there are some differences anatomically. I don't know if I could point to any particular environmental adaptations that could suggest the reason for those changes. People are very selective, too. It's very possible that some of these traits were maybe just selected because they look better on some versus others. I really couldn't. I don't know if I can speak to that very well. But I would think the brow ridges itself, just increased cranial thickness, would eventually cause almost any of us to have brow ridges if we were 500 years old. It's kind of an assumption, but I think a reasonable one.
Chris, I've studied this topic and similar topics myself, and I wanted to congratulate you. You did a very good job. The point I want to make is that with regard to the importance of the discussion from the standpoint of fossils is that that is what is used as the selling feature to the public. The public does not understand DNA, or they can't really comprehend it. So everything with regard to it doesn't matter whether it's human evolution or macroevolution of any sort is sold to the public on the basis of fossils. And what you'll find when you actually get down and study the true fossils upon which this is based is that there is a certain amount of variability in every species, whether extinct or living. And if you were to study any animal that is living today, you would find that in almost every case there is as much variability within a living species as there is in the story that is told concerning the evolution up to that species. So that if we took all of these people that are in this room right here and took their skulls, their teeth, their bones, which is what the paleontologists used, if we took the people just in this room, that would allow for hundreds of evolutionary stories over millions of years because of the tremendous variability within us today. And so, and that's a lot of what you're showing us there is that in the human species, lots of variability. Within the ape species, lots of variability. And so you can come up with all kinds of stories.
That's a good point. Thank you.
You said that the skull thicknesses of Homo erectus fell within modern human ethnic groups like Aboriginal things, but that they also could be connected to age. So is there any connection now with age, with thicker skulls, or are they just people with thick skulls?
Well, I think there's more than one contributing factor. Clearly, genetics is a big one. There's just a lot of variation within the human population, as said, but I think you can suggest a great number of factors that could be responsible. What is genetics more probable in explaining the robust skulls than is age? I think you could go either way with that, but I think both were clearly responsible. I mean, I think the longevity argument is very, very powerful. So I guess I tend to kind of shift in that direction when examining these ancient groups of peoples. But that would be something I might flip flop on the next day, go on more genetics the next time around. So so I'm not sure I could argue which of those may be more likely a factor to.
is there any evidence, photographic or otherwise, of ape-like creatures walking upright?
I mean, even today, ape-like creatures can walk upright for brief periods of time. So that they can is unquestionable. That they do for extended periods of time without being trained specifically, forced to do so through a period of positive reinforcement. It doesn't seem to be any credible evidence to support that.
Thank you for a great presentation. And I agree that there is a tremendous amount of diversity even today. I mean, when you look at the Australian Aborigines, you can really see a lot of difference between typical United States people. And I can't remember where I saw it, whether it was Lubinow's book or somewhere else, where I saw illustration of modern humans that varied greatly. I mean, really greatly. My goodness, I had a roommate in college that we all thought looked like a Neanderthal, and we teased him about it. And of course, he was really good on the football team because he scared the opponents.
A lot of variation, that's true. There's a lot of variation.
If I wanted to learn more about the history of the discus, could you repeat the name of that site in England where they have those axes?
Yeah, I might be easier to pull it up. Yeah, they've been found all over Europe, England, so I can show you the diagram again. Now, I pulled this specific diagram off of Wikipedia. Okay, so the one that I have there up top, I pulled that directly off Wikipedia. And this is just a heritage park where they had found some Homo erectus with the hand axes in England. But that's the distribution of where they have found those. And you can just search directly for hand axes and bam, lots and lots of information. And in the article on hand axes on Wikipedia specifically, they mention throwing them like a super frisbee. So, but it may be more, so whether it'd be better to throw them one way or another, I don't know. It was Marvin Lubinow's book, Bones of Contention, that mentioned the discus event and the possible relationship between those two that I thought was a strong argument.
Why was Adam, how come don't people talk about Adam bending down and acting like apes back then?
What? Say that again.
I think what he meant is, why don't people talk about Adam as if he were an ape-like creature? I think you touched on that when you were talking about at what point do the people become real in the Bible? Was Adam an ape-like creature?
Yeah. I mean, within your theistic evolutionist group, you're going to have some that just don't believe Adam was a real man at all, that the story in the Garden of Eden was not a real event. Others that are going to argue that Adam was probably an ape-like ancestor that God then came down and modified. That God was involved in the creation at multiple points throughout the billions of years, and at some point when evolution had reached a certain stage, when ape-like ancestors reached a certain stage, then God came in and maybe improved his cognitive capabilities and gave him a soul, and maybe that was the first Adam. But that the Bible says he was formed from the dust of the ground, it's a little bit of a loose rendering there, text.
Last month we had a movie, I think from Vision Forum. Doug Phillips had produced it, and it showed a whole warehouse in Peru of skulls with huge rearward projections, and it was really interesting. Do you have any comments on skulls like that?
I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but there have been a lot of cultures that did skull shaping. Yeah. So it's probably, there's some that are like cone-shaped, and that's clearly, I would think, done through banding. When the child is very, very young, they can come in and shape the skull. And some, they would end up stretching the neck by using banding, and others, they just come in when it's really, really young and start adding bands to the skull and can eventually get the skull to grow up in those kind of shapes. If that's what you're referring to, kind of a cone head looking thing, probably done through skull shaping very early on, as opposed to those being in any way Neanderthals or something like that, I don't think.
This is back to this question. If those were sharp edges all on every side, how are you going to throw that without cutting your hand?
I would think very carefully. But I think the advantage of it being sharpened on all edge was a trade-off. You know, it might be likely to catch a nick on it when you're throwing it, but that's what I think that disc, if you just held it and then threw it as a disc, it's just going to come straight out of your hand. He mentioned in the book that they had done some studies on this and showed that with a high percentage of a high number of times, it would end up landing point end down. So they actually did some tests, getting some people to throw them discus-like, and it would end up landing point side down. You know, so I don't know. It's an argument. You know, but like I say, there are multiple explanations for how those were used. There's others. Other than them being in a core or used as a projectile, hand axe is still probably one of the most commonly accepted, that they were just actually used as an instrument for carving, you know, after big hunts when you're trying to get through a mammoth, using them to cut through a mammoth. But, you know, if you'd cut yourself throwing it, well, you'd cut yourself a whole lot worse by banging on something with that thing in your hand. You know, I just can't imagine. So.
The other comment on what you said about the skull shaping, here in Oregon, they had the flathead Indians that definitely shaped the heads.
Pushed down on it when they were young, same kind of thing, yeah.
You mentioned the propaganda speaks volumes, and I was just curious to see if you'd be able to provide an estimate of the economic investments that have been made for the theory of evolution and compare it to the creation. How much investment's been made over since Darwin's theory?
Well, today, you know, because, I mean, as far as government grants and those kind of things are concerned, all the money goes to supporting evolution at this point. The national academies, which is, you know, a national government agency whose main objective is to advise policymakers on areas of science, is overwhelmingly atheistic. A recent study done by Edward Larson, who teaches at Pepperdine University, showed that the lowest rate, as far as scientific disciplines in the National Academy of Science, there were 95% of the biologists in the National Academy of Science were either atheist or agnostic. Only 5% of the biologists in the National Academies believed in God. 95% were either atheist or agnostic. And the highest rate of belief was in astronomers, but that was only still like 93%. I mean, this is an agency whose sole purpose is to advise policymakers on issues of science, and they are overwhelmingly atheistic. And so I think it's one of the primary influences on where government grants go is these kind of advising agencies, like the National Academies. I mean, you're just not going to get grants today that will support research that are in any way favorable of creation, in any way whatsoever. So I think what we're really looking at, and the reason why creationists seem to be on the losing end, is we're in a court of public opinion. We're fighting a battle in the courtroom of public opinion. And if you go into court any given day and you have your one attorney against the other side that has 20 attorneys, I don't care how good the evidence is to support your side, you're going to lose. Because that's what they're doing. They're investing money to support a position. And you shift the work that much, one side versus the other, and I don't care how what the evidence really is, you can get it to support another position. Because that's what we're doing. We're basically examining the same evidence. But if you have more money to support your interpretation of that evidence, you're going to have a stronger argument. And that's what's happening. And that's why we're losing. They just have all the money. That's where all the education is. All the grants are in that direction. And more than anything else, that's why they have the more powerful argument. It's not that they're true. It's just that they have all the attorneys. And you're by yourself over here trying to... What's the old saying about a person defending himself? You know what I'm saying? There's an old saying about a person that defends himself has a fool for an attorney, something like that. And I don't know. That's kind of... We don't have any money.
I realize, this presentation is mostly focused on the paleontology and archaeology and stuff, but I do hear a lot of arguments from evolutionists involving genetics. So, in line with the first question the gentleman in front of me asked, I was watching part of this presentation by a theistic evolutionist, and he was using this argument about a fused chromosome. Evidently, if I remember the details right, apes have more chromosomes or something than we do, and so the argument is two of these chromosomes fused together, and you look at a certain human chromosome, and you can see that it was fused from two others, or at least it looks that way. And his argument is, if it was just created that way, then God is making it appear like it evolved when it didn't, which makes him a liar. How do we respond to that kind of statement?
I'm not really sure about that particular argument, but I think you got to slightly. I think the apes have fewer chromosomes than we do, but I think it's 46 versus like 42. But you may be right, but I think so, that they have slightly fewer number than we do. But I don't know. Genetics is a tricky thing, and there are mutations that can cause dramatic changes. Down syndrome and these kind of things are due to a chromosome being triplicated. You end up with 3 of a particular chromosome, so the person now has 1 more than everyone else in the population. Could that produce advantageous results as well as deleterious results? Yeah, for sure. I mean, but I think where evolution is missing the mark with regarding genetics, and the reason why we're so slow on progress in genetics is that they don't realize the cell was designed. Whatever evolution has happened or is happening today is not due to random mutations of genes. That's an affront to logic. It's an affront to reason. It's just ridiculous to assume that you could randomly change information and improve upon that information, increase the information in the genome. It's just a ridiculous assumption. What they failed to understand is that the cell was designed to alter the DNA of an individual to help it adapt to particular environments when creating offspring. And at this point, I don't think we can predict how much could take place. So, a lot of young Earth creationists believe that, the changes that are taking place within populations are simply due to the rearranging of pre-existing genes. But that just does not seem to be the case. We know that certain genes have increased in number within populations like the humans dramatically, if we believe that the number of people on board the ark is credible. So we know how many people were reintroduced after the flood. There were just 8. So that gives us a specific number of genes that would be present in a particular locus, a location on a chromosome. But we can look at some genes, and there are clearly genes in the hundreds. But rather than these genes being created through random mutagenesis, it's more likely that the cell was intentionally designed by God to increase diversity, to potentially change genes in response to environmental needs. That there is a direction to it all. That organisms are able to adapt to specific environmental conditions or needs because there's a machinery in the cell to change genes, to make rearrangements, if you will, in order to help them adapt. So, well, there you go. Something to think about. Anyway.
Back to the hand axes. I was thinking you could just have a leather strap around your hand to prevent being cut by it.
I mean, it's possible, but why would you sharpen that end? That's the question. Why would you sharpen that end if you were intending to hold it there? I know you could protect yourself, put your big piece of leather on there, or put some skin, or nice bunch of fur, big pad of fur or something. Clearly, you could protect yourself. But the weird thing is they're all sharpened on the back edge, too. And if you're going to hold it that way, you would round that off. More.
Okay, last one. A duplicate question.
I just wanted to address the question that was asked, the one before this one. If you go to Answers in Genesis website, Georgia Purdom has an article specifically addressing your question. And it's over my head, but you might be able to understand it.
She's a geneticist, though, working with Institute for Creation Research right now. She has a couple of videos out, Wonders of the Cells, the title of one of them. I bet you can find a couple of her seminars back there. Georgia Purdom. I'm not sure I can spell her last name, Purdom, or something close to that. So the books that I reference, Buried Alive by Jack Cuozzo, very, very good. And he's the one that managed to x-ray several actual Neanderthal skulls in France and Germany. The other book was Marvin Lubinau's Bones of Contention. Very substantial work done by Marvin Lubinau. There's one other, Ape-Men Factor Fallacy, I believe is a title by Malcolm Bowden. It's probably the next most significant work as far as a book by a creationist, but there's lots of stuff out there. Lots of stuff. I've also written articles on many of these subjects on the Creation Wiki. So we started like a Wikipedia type encyclopedia website, except specifically from the creation point of view. So you can go in and look up some Creation Wiki, see creation, wiki.org or .com. So I wrote, whenever I do research on a subject, in addition to reading, I think it helps me a lot if I write. It helps me remember if I write. So I went in and wrote an article as I was doing research on Homo erectus, Java man, Peking man. For me, when I do research, it helps if I write. Remember it a lot longer. It's a good tip for potential students out there. It's huge. It takes about 500,000 hits per month. It's on a dedicated server. We started it in 2004, and now it's consumed about half of my life, I think. Like websites can do if you're not careful. But anyone, you can register for an account, but only creationists can edit articles. We want it to specifically be from the creation point of view, and we state that up front, so it's good stuff, though.
Thanks, Chris. Let's give him a big hand again.